Stop right there, because what happened in the Gulf is not just another headline. It is not just another ship. It is not just another warning. And it is definitely not just another round of diplomatic theater. What happened is this. The United States tried to prove it could choke Iran's pressure campaign at sea. Iran, directly or indirectly, tested that pressure. The U.S. responded by seizing an Iranian-flagged cargo ship. Iran called it aggression. Trump is now publicly saying he does not want to extend the ceasefire and wants a deal quickly, and that combination, military pressure on one side, diplomatic urgency on the other, is exactly how crises stop looking controlled. And that is why you need to watch this all the way through, because the real story here is not whether one ship got through. The real story is whether the U.S. blockade is already creating more pressure than Washington can comfortably manage, and whether Iran has figured out that simply forcing America to enforce it publicly and dramatically may be enough to shake the whole diplomatic track. That is the story. And if you understand that, then you understand why Trump suddenly sounds like a man who wants a deal now, not later. Now let's slow this down. The United States announced and enforced a naval blockade aimed at Iranian-linked shipping around the Strait of Hormuz, after ceasefire efforts failed to produce a lasting agreement. AP reported last week that Trump said the U.S. Navy would begin a blockade of ships entering or leaving the Strait of Hormuz. Then, over the weekend, Reuters and AP reported that U.S. forces seized an Iranian-flagged cargo ship, the MV Tosca, after it tried to pass the blockade. According to Reuters and other reporting, Tehran condemned the seizure as a violation of the ceasefire and demanded a response. That is the first thing you need to understand. This was not theoretical anymore. The blockade moved from threat to enforcement. And that changes everything. Because blockades are dangerous by nature. Once you declare one, you are no longer just sending political signals. You are daring the other side to either submit, challenge you, or force you into a visible confrontation. And once that confrontation happens, once Marines are boarding ships, once engines are being disabled, once both sides are accusing each other of aggression, the crisis becomes much harder to control. Now here is where it gets more serious. A lot of people will look at this and say, well, if the U.S. seized the ship, then the blockade worked. That is too simple. Tactically, yes, the U.S. showed it could intercept and seize a vessel. Reuters and AP both described the Tosca seizure as the first major enforcement action since the blockade began. But strategically, the bigger question is different. What happens when enforcing the blockade itself starts poisoning the peace process it was supposed to strengthen? Reuters reported that uncertainty around the next U.S.-Iran talks grew immediately after the U.S. seized the cargo ship, with Tehran treating the incident as a major obstacle. And that is the contradiction. Washington wants leverage, but leverage is now colliding with diplomacy. Trump wants to look strong, but the stronger the blockade becomes, the easier it is for Iran to say, "You are not negotiating in good faith." The United States wants talks, but every dramatic enforcement move gives Tehran a new argument for why talks should be delayed, reshaped, or rejected. And in wars like this, delay is not neutral. Delay is power. Now think about this from Iran's side. Iran does not need to sink a U.S. warship to complicate the blockade. It does not need some spectacular naval victory. It may only need to create a situation where the United States has to choose between two bad options: enforce the blockade hard and damage diplomacy, or soften enforcement and look weak. That is the real pressure point. And the reporting strongly suggests that is exactly where things are heading. Iran has condemned the seizure, talks are uncertain, and mediators are scrambling as the ceasefire deadline approaches. That is why the title matters, not because Iran literally destroyed the blockade, which I could not verify, but because it may have exposed the blockade's political cost, and that cost is rising fast. Today, Reuters reported that Trump said he does not want to extend the ceasefire with Iran. He said the U.S. is in a strong negotiating position, that we don't have that much time, and that military action could resume if talks fail. That is not the language of a patient White House settling into a long diplomatic process. That is the language of urgency, impatience, and narrowing options. Now ask yourself why. Why does Trump suddenly sound like he wants this wrapped up quickly? Part of the answer is obvious. Ceasefires are fragile, and prolonged uncertainty makes leaders look weak. But there is a deeper reason, because the blockade may be creating exactly the kind of crisis Washington wanted to prevent. The Strait of Hormuz is not some remote side issue. It is one of the most sensitive maritime choke points in the world. Reuters reported days ago that Iran temporarily reopened the strait, but warned it could close it again if the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports continued. And the wider reporting on this conflict has repeatedly emphasized that around a fifth of global oil and LNG trade normally passes through Hormuz. Once tension there escalates, you are not just dealing with military risk. You're dealing with energy markets, shipping insurance, allied panic, and global economic pressure. That means Trump is not only negotiating with Iran, he is negotiating against time. Time before the ceasefire expires, time before another maritime clash, time before oil markets panic again, time before the region convinces itself that diplomacy has failed, and that is why this feels more desperate than the public statements alone might suggest. Publicly, Trump says America is strong. Privately, or at least structurally, the situation is much messier, because the U.S. now has to defend the credibility of the blockade, keep pressure on Iran, hold the diplomatic process together, reassure allies, and stop the entire region from sliding back into open war. That is a massive burden, and burdens like that make leaders want deals fast, not because they are weak, but because they can see the cost of waiting. Now here's where the story gets even darker. The blockade is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening inside a war environment where the ceasefire is already shaky and future talks are unclear. AP reported today that both Washington and Tehran are still signaling some willingness to resume talks in Islamabad, but Iran's participation remains publicly unconfirmed, while Trump is warning that lots of bombs could fall if no agreement is reached. Reuters separately reported that Vice President J.D. Vance had not yet left for Pakistan, another sign that the process is still unstable. In other words, the whole system is wobbling. Talks may happen. Talks may not happen. The ceasefire may hold. The ceasefire may collapse. The blockade may remain leverage. The blockade may become the reason leverage fails. That is not stability. That is a countdown. And when you put all of that together, Trump's urgency starts to make sense. He does not just want a deal because deals look good. He wants a deal because the alternative is a second phase of the crisis that may be much more dangerous than the first. Think about what the next phase could look like. More ship seizures, more U.S.-Iran confrontation at sea, more threats around Hormuz, more market shock, more pressure from allies, more missile threats in the region, and a ceasefire expiration hanging over everything like a trigger nobody wants to touch, but nobody can walk away from either. That is why this story is bigger than one cargo ship. The Tuska seizure was a signal that the blockade is real, a signal that Iran is willing to test the edge, a signal that the United States is willing to act, and a signal that every action now carries diplomatic fallout. Now let's talk plainly. If you are watching this from the United States, the instinct is to see a blockade as a clean show of strength. The U.S. Navy draws a line, Iran learns the lesson, negotiations follow from pressure. But real life is not that neat. Pressure can coerce, yes. It can also corner. And cornered states do not always come to the table in a weaker mood. Sometimes they come to the table angrier, more suspicious, and more determined to prove they still have cards to play. AP reported today that Iran has warned it holds new cards for the battlefield. Whether that is bluff, posture, or a real threat, it tells you something important. Tehran does not want to look like a country being forced into submission. That matters because perception drives escalation. If Tehran believes the U.S. is using talks as cover for coercion, it hardens. If Washington believes Iran is using diplomacy to buy time, it hardens. If both sides harden at once, then the ceasefire becomes less a path to peace and more a short pause before another collision. And that is exactly the danger now. This is why you should pay close attention to Trump's wording today. He did not sound like someone preparing the public for a patient diplomacy. He sounded like someone preparing the public for a quick decision. Either a deal happens soon, or the military option comes back to the front of the table. Reuters reporting is very clear on that point. And once a leader starts speaking that way, every new incident becomes more dangerous. A delayed delegation, a disputed ship seizure, a warning shot, a blocked tanker, a breakdown in Islamabad. Any of these could become the moment where the entire process tips. That is why the blockade matters so much, not because it has already solved anything, but because it has forced the confrontation into a zone where military symbolism and diplomatic timing are colliding in public, and that is very hard to manage. So, did Iran destroy the U.S. Navy blockade? No. I could not verify that. And the available reporting points the other way tactically, because the U.S. did seize a ship. But did Iran expose something important about the blockade? Absolutely. It exposed that blockades do not only punish the target, they also test the patience, credibility, and political flexibility of the power enforcing them. And right now, that power is the United States, which brings us back to Trump. He wants a deal now because now may be the last moment when Washington can still claim both strength and control at the same time. Wait too long, and the blockade could look like the start of a larger war. Move too fast, and the deal could look weak. That is the trap. And today's rhetoric from Trump, combined with the shaky state of the Pakistan talks and the fallout from the cargo ship seizure, suggests the White House knows the trap is real. So here is the bottom line. The Gulf is no longer in a holding pattern. The blockade has been tested. The ceasefire is nearing its deadline. Talks are uncertain. Trump is impatient. Iran is angry. And the next move may decide whether this remains a coercive negotiation or turns back into open conflict. That is the real story tonight. Not that one side has already won, not that the blockade has already collapsed, but that the pressure is now so high and the clock is now so short that everyone involved can feel the same thing. This is reaching the point where one more incident could force a decision nobody is truly ready to make. And that is why Trump wants a deal fast. Because when a blockade starts generating more risk than certainty, even the strongest navy in the world cannot guarantee what happens next.